All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're putting on our literary critic hats to decode a seriously grim, gothic fable known as the Diatribe of the Living Ink. What we're really looking at here is a deeply Nietzschean rebellion against a completely stagnant world. So if you're someone who loves heavy philosophical allegories wrapped up in dark, poetic imagery, you are definitely in for a treat. We're going to break down how a cast of defiant archetypes uses the raw power of chaos to literally rewrite existence itself. We are pulled straight into the cold soot and chaos right from the jump with this cutting line, "Behold the King of Ash." This is hissed by our first archetype, the wit, and it instantly sets this incredibly oppressive, dark atmosphere. It's a fiercely defiant opening monologue, and it perfectly sets the stage for a massive ideological clash between order and chaos. Moving into Section 1, the King of Ash, focusing on stagnation and authority. So, to really grasp our antagonist here, the King of Ash, we have to see that his quote-unquote absolute authority is literally just a trembling papier-mâché mask. He represents this heavily calcified order, enforcing what the text calls the last man, which is the state of wretched contentment. It's essentially a creative tomb, where the soul just rots in a faceless gray wen. And instead of the will to power, he demands the will to nap, a terminal state of striving that only results in a rigid mechanical gait. This vividly paints the deeply stagnant reality our archetypes are fighting against. They aren't just fighting a king, they are battling the death of creativity itself. Next up, Section 2, the wit's delightful absurdity. Our first archetype operates entirely through this lens of delightful absurdity. He doesn't wield a sword, right? His weapon is his laughter, which acts like a serrated blade cutting through the heavy silence with a defiant monologue, "I bring you the medicine of the spill to turn your calcified order into a heap of delightful absurdity." The wit is essentially declaring that no truth, if it's held too tightly, can survive his chaotic medicine. He distorts the very gaze of authority to prove that rigidity is actually a profound weakness. This brilliant contrast really highlights the wit's specific mechanism of rebellion. You pit the calcified order, those pristine, untouched blueprints of the ruling class, directly against delightful absurdity, which is the medicine of the spill, actively smudging those blueprints into chaos. It's all about transforming those rigid, fragile structures into a messy, glorious heap. Because, you can't unspill ink, and you definitely can't unring the bell of absurdity. Which brings us to Section 3, the hunger's dynamic void. Now, this next archetype is a totally different beast. The hunger coils like a dynamic void. Where the King of Ash sees a precise, untouchable tapestry of order, the hunger, well, he just sees a highly nutritious feast. Your tapestry of order is but a feast for my absence. He is openly mocking the heralds and those precise equations they use to try and govern the stars. He looks at their grand plans for what the text calls the long tiredness and basically just licks his lips. So how exactly does the hunger consume all this order? It breaks down into a pretty fascinating three-step process. First, he inhales the threats of order until his void is completely full. Second, he transforms their rigid definitions of justice into a wet slurry. And third, he leaves their pristine logic as a messy, totally unscripted improvisation. By swallowing these blueprints whole, the hunger ensures the tragedy of forced order undergoes this exact chaotic dismantling, leaving everyone in authority looking around in a cacophony of, wait, how did this happen? Moving right along to Section 4, the Small's artful error. Now, the Small doesn't use serrated laughter or a consuming void. Instead, she whispers through the velvet gloom like a gentle breeze, a breeze that reminds calcified bones how to actually dance again. Through this highly theatrical declaration, the Small promises to trip the striving soul right out of its rigid gait. A single hiccup in the rhythm of the universe is enough to smudge your ash against the living page. It's incredibly potent because it highlights exactly how little it takes to disrupt the terminal will to nap. Just a tiny error, a slight smudge, and the whole oppressive system stumbles. And these artful mistakes actually end up saving reality. Think about the impossible tension of the king's order, something as grim as a literal decree of execution. But then, through a simple, tiny nudge acting as an essential pressure valve, she miraculously turns it into a decree of desert. I mean, she actually calls her error art. By doing this, she prevents reality from just snapping in half under the universe's rigid tension. Let's look at Section 5, the Wanderer's fluid becoming. The Wanderer surveys everything that's happened, all the so-called tragedy of this stagnant world, and just raises a wooden jester's wand to reframe the whole thing into a grand comedy. Delivered directly to the architect of Ash and an invisible audience, this powerful line shows the Wanderer fully embracing the heat of chaotic medicine. Even in the heart of the desert, the ink remains wet and the page remains damp. It's a profound statement of resilience. Life, creation, and the living ink simply cannot be dried out by the king's ash. It's a stark contrast between these two opposing forces. You have the architect of ash relying entirely on the manifest weight of negation, clutching an iron hammer with white knuckles, focused purely on justified termination. And then you have the wanderer operating in grand comedy, wielding a simple wooden jester's wand and moving with the fluid grace of becoming. It really exposes how brittle the old ruling guard's tools are compared to a joyful, fluid embrace of the unknown. Finally, Section 6, Triumph of Living Ink. When we synthesize these four rebellious acts, we find the ultimate force at the core of this fable, the living ink. It's a complete shift away from the stagnant, forced order of the last man, represented by that cold soot, those precise equations, and calcified bones. Instead, we move toward the messy, living page of dynamic creation, represented by the spill, the wet slurry, and ultimately the altar of creation. The rigid architectural order just doesn't stand a chance against the chaotic, transformative fluidity of life. To truly embrace this chaotic creation, the text tells us the soul must finally find the courage to go under upon the altar of creation. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought directly inspired by the Wanderer's philosophy. Will you find the courage to go under and write the next line of existence? Think about your own relationship with chaos and order right now. Are you holding on to pristine, calcified blueprints, or are you ready to pick up the wet ink? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the living page.